So, I would like to introduce to you philosophical psychology. Um, these ideas that I'm going to present to you were first formulated by Aristotle, and they were developed and clarified by St. Thomas Aquinas. As I've reviewed what I've written, one thing that stood out to me is the ancientness of the ideas that I'm presenting. I mean, this is coming from medieval Europe and ancient Greek. Um, and it would be tempting for a modern listener to dismiss these ideas as antiquated, uh, based on the obvious advancements we have made in our culture through empiricism. But I wouldn't be so quick to dismiss these old ideas, because the men who came up with them, they weren't stupid. Um, they did not have a regimented method of inquiry like the scientific method, but they were rational, and they approached this from through deductive reasoning, um, and they approached it rationally. And these ideas are especially important to the alcoholic who suffers from a spiritual malady, the alcoholic who needs a spiritual solution. So these maybe antiquated, these ancient ideas approach human spirituality and contain an explanation for it. And I think that's really relevant to the alcoholic. So I would like to analyze life in general and human life in particular. Here we apply metaphysics to the human person. We will be looking at life through the lens of the soul. The soul is the principle of life, and human life is intellectual life. This is where Aristotle succeeds and modern psychology fails, because Aristotle understands that man has a spiritual nature. Any psychology that does not admit to human spirituality misunderstands human person at a fundamental level and cannot always ultimately be successful. Now, if one admits to human spirituality, the good question is raised that it is obvious we have a body. And if we have a body, how can we have a spirit? And if we do have a spirit, what is its relationship to the body? Here, the power of Aristotle's metaphysics can explain this. All living things exist, and therefore they are substances. If they are substances, then they can be explained by material and formal causes. Matter is being and potency, form is act. Now, the soul can't be in the body because life is a definite perfection, and the body is only being and potency. It is not life, but the subject of life. So the soul is found in the form. Aristotle says there are two types of actuality. One is like knowledge possessed, the other the act of knowing. When one is ignorant of physics, then one has knowledge potentially. And when one studies physics, one gains knowledge and act, but the knowledge possessed is potential to the act of knowing. For the knowledge of physics precedes the moment the knowledge is applied when one takes a test. The knowledge possessed can exist without the act of knowing, but the act of knowing cannot exist without the knowledge possessed. It is evidence that the soul is like knowledge possessed, for one remains alive while one is sleeping. Being as awake is like the act of knowing, being asleep like the knowledge possessed. And knowledge possessed is prior to the act of knowing. Therefore, we define the soul as the primary act of a body potentially alive. Here we see that the soul is defined and limited by the body. A plant does not have intelligence because there is no potency for intelligence in the body. Defining life in terms of form alone will be incomplete, for it is the composite that properly exists. The form exists to actualize some subject, to be determined by matter. Therefore, a definition of the soul that leaves out matter is incomplete. The soul is primary act because it is prior to the powers and faculties such as intellect and sensation. The soul is a primary act because it is prior to the powers and faculties such as intellect or sensation. Before one can have an intellectual life, one must first be alive. From this it follows that the soul and the body are one, just as wax and the impression made from the wax are one. And that's really important. And I'll repeat it. The soul and the body are one, just as wax and the impression made in the wax are one. If the eye were an animal, then sight would be its soul. For sight is the primary act of an eye, its form. The eye is the material condition of sight and is only sight potentially. With this example, we see the unity of body and soul. For sight cannot exist without the eye. Neither can the eye exist without sight. Without sight, the eye is no longer an eye and is equivalent to a stone eye or a painted eye. It is the form which makes things to be. This example reveals the difference between modern reductionism and the philosophy of substance. The reduction looks at the material aspect of the eye as substance, and sight and blindness as accidents. So we have a view from the top down. Form gives being to the potentiality of matter. And from the bottom up, sight is an emergent property of matter. But the material cause is insufficient to describe being because matter contains the principle of potency, which is of itself sufficient to explain being. Which is itself insufficient to explain being. Therefore, modern materialism misses the essence of everything it studies. It can only explain accidents which are inseparable from matter. The philosophy of substance offers a clearer and more direct approach to being. We have defined the soul, but what does it mean to live? Life is predicated in different ways, in things that take nourishment and grow and decay, in things with sensation and movement, in things with intellect. The first mode of life is found in plants, the second is found in animals, and the third is man. For plants are alive because they take nourishment and grow, animals are alive because of sensation, and man because of his intellect. Each element presupposes the level beneath it. To have sensation presupposes growth and decay, and to have intellect presupposes sensation, and so on. So we see that the soul is one principle underlying three distinct modes of life. What is the relationship between these powers with each other in the soul and the powers of the soul itself? Can these modes of life be identified with the soul, or are they parts of the soul? This question is easily answered in the simple life of plants. Its vegetative principle is the soul. But this question becomes more difficult when we consider more complex lives, such as animals and humans. Aristotle answers this by stating that these modes of life in higher animals cannot be identified with the soul because the modes of life are distinct. We know this because some organisms contain some of these modes. Some contain some of these modes, and man contains them all. We also know this because different potentialities are known as distinct by the different acts that arise from them. So each of these modes is a part of the soul, with the soul being identified with its principal part. So, man's soul is identified with his intellect, and sensation or growth are parts of his soul. So let us consider the human soul. Man is defined as a rational animal. So in man there will be powers he shares with animals, and he will have powers that are unique to man. Man is complex and has multiple powers of the soul, and these powers are distinct from each other and from the soul by the principle that faculties are made distinct from their formal objects. For example, sight is distinguished from hearing by the object of color. The intellect differs from the will by its object of truth, and the object of the will is the good. The faculties of the soul are accidents of the soul. It is not the soul that understands of itself, it is through the faculty of the intellect that the soul understands. The essence of the soul is a real potential which receives existence from God, and this existence is distinct from the act of the faculties, because a thing must be before it acts.